Good morning, everyone. Happy, smiling, fun-loving bunch here this morning. We got a good night's sleep. I almost got 10 minutes this morning. Almost. Well, this is our 20th time to have this event. And 20 years ago, I never imagined we would be here this long and doing this and having the support that we've had. There's a lot of people could have done this without their name on the slide, and there's so many others I see several faces that have been here for most of them. I see at least one face that was here at the very first one, which kind of happened and almost kind of didn't because of an ice storm that came in. And they closed campus, and people still showed up. So we had a symposium on a closed campus, not how or where we expected, but it was a fantastic start. And I guess because of that weather event that kind of curtailed our first attempt, we made a second attempt. We thought, well, if we're going to do it twice, we're going to do it 3 times. And I saw some grants and got some external funding to help get the thing off the ground. We got 3 years of that from historical organizations. It evolved over years. We started in the old student center before we had this one. It was torn down, and they had this facility available, which is phenomenal, I think. It's been a good place to have this, and we have got plenty of room and have what we need. We've got good people that take care of us here. But you may have noticed it's 20th and final annual event. Things happen, circumstances change, and all. And from my end, 20 is a good time, I think, to wrap it up. My part, there'll be other things going on, and you know, someday down the road, there's an occasion, and we might have something else. This is going to be a regular end. But don't be at school railroads. Not continuous. I think 20 years is a good run for an event like that. I've seen a lot not making it long. But it's thanks to y'all and support, and have so many people that hitting up every year. That's fantastic. And the level of research that we've had has been over the years. It's just been people doing research rankings. But what y'all bring to this will rival, and that's kudos. I'm just honored to have had the opportunity to make something like this happen for the time it did. And those of you that have been coming several years, you know that our core that we're really targeting to try to preserve history from, most of those people are no longer with us, and that saddens me. But the thing that we really wanted to do when we started this, and Ed Cooper was kind of the kick in the pants that I needed to do something like this that I had been wanting to do. And he contacted me and said, hey, I'm writing a book and I'd like to talk to some of the local railroads. So that's what prompted the start of this. It was initially Cotton Belt, because we were doing it for a specific purpose, to try to gather local history, commerce and Cotton Belt, and some specific things. But of course it grew and evolved, and we're regional now, spread over several states. And proud to have been able to have a role in that. And, very honored. Anyway, we have some wonderful programs. We have a full program this year. We have 7 presentations scheduled, which is more than we usually do, but it's hard to say no when people come and say, yeah, I've got a presentation and tell what it is, like, man, everybody would be interested in that. So we need to have that on the program. So, probably around about 4:30, at least probably 4:30 this afternoon to get everything in. We will have a lunch break. We'll be in the traditions room next door. They'll have that set up and ready for us at noon. So we'll shoot for that. If we're not exactly on the schedule here, I'm just trying to kind of make things fit, but if you've been here before, we're not watching the second hand on that, so but we'll get there. All right. Well, our first presenter this morning is a gentleman who's been with us for quite a while and done some very fascinating presentations on a wide variety of topics of interest all across Texas and Arkansas and most of the regional railroad systems. He is a fantastic researcher and digs in and gets all the dirt on people, so it's just really interesting from that aspect. So I'll turn it over to Gerald to make me on.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Is that any better? Yes. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Gerald Hook. I have a question for you. How many of you are on railroad retirement? Yay. That's the best job I have ever had. I'll give you a little background on a personal background. Born in Dallas. My sister Cindy is with me. She's been my right hand, been my big helper for all these years. For a number. My wife is having some health issues, and I didn't know until Tuesday of this week if I was actually going to make this trip. But she is in good hands. She's up with her daughter up in Bella Vista, Arkansas, and her daughter's husband is a physician. He's an OB-GYN. We won't need his help or anything, but it is nice to have a doctor. I can I'll call him, and he's been a big help in trying to determine, well, kind of help us out and figure out what's going on with Kitty. So, as you see here on the title slide, I have one of the questions I had for ages. We all knew the railroad were being welcomed in where they were being built. And I thought, well, they said it was always fat. Well, how much I've been doing. I do a lot of research with newspaper.com, and which that's the best $150 every 6 months. It's the best I've ever made. Also the Portable Texas History, which is free, and I've used it for probably 20 years. If you're in Oklahoma, they have Oklahoma history, basically the same thing, same format and everything. It's the Texas side. So this is the program. We'll see how well this thing goes. One of the questions I had, because I was a salesman, I didn't mention I was in the Southern Railroad for 20 and a half years. Started in Dallas, 7.5 years as chief clerk. I started in 1970, and my first promotion to a sales representative was in Minneapolis. And Connie and I and the boys spent 3 years up there. We saw 102 above in the 3 years. We also saw 30 degrees below zero. And I finally got accustomed enough and got to go out and rail fit until about 10 or 12 below zero. That was it. But one of the big questions I always had was, well, what makes railroading unique? And I finally came to the conclusion, it's rights of way. As you see on the screen, the other surface modes of transportation are on public rights of way. But only railroads are on private rights of way, and that's the difference. We maintain it ourselves, and we're the only ones who can use that right of way. So go back and try to figure out, okay, what were the rates? I'm reading about, and coming across stuff that the customary stagecoach fare was 10 cents a mile. Okay, well, what if I can prove it? So I was trying to figure out how in the world could I prove this thing. And one day I came across this book, and I came across a gentleman who wrote it. His name was Dr. Bob Crossman. This Butterfield Overland Mail. Dr. Crossman is a retired Methodist minister. He was also he was in charge of the Arkansas Conference of the United Methodist Church, and is, of course, retired, lives in Conway. Absolute wonderful gentleman. And an envelope you see on the screen there, he bought that envelope. He was a stamp collector. It was his hobby. His father was a stamp collector, his grandfather. So he was a stamp collector. He came across this thing, and he bought it, and he didn't think too much of it, but a friend of his saw it, and he said, that was on the Overland Mail. If you notice, postage is 10 cents. It was postmarked in San Francisco in April of 1859. And on the other side, it says via the Overland via Los Angeles. So this was on the Overland Mail. Sidebar on when you're writing a letter you're somewhere in this river, you want to write a letter to somebody out in California. You use that thing via a different route out to California. You must have another one that would go on by a sailing ship around the Cape Horn and up from the west coast of the United States. That only took about 3 months. Another one that would go to the Atlantic side of the Panama, of Panama, which at that time was part of Colombia. And that would go across to the Pacific side, would be picked up by another sailing vessel to go to San Francisco, or the west coast. And then the Butterfield Overland Mail. You also had, of course, the Pony Express. Pony Express was $10 a ticket on an envelope per letter. This was 10 cents. So he found this, and when he found it, he said, well, gee, I want to learn more about it. So he is a tremendous historian, and he wrote this book. I know I made a personal friend, and I said, told him I was going to do this program, and I said, could I use the material out of your book? He said, absolutely, said to me. So I'm able to use the material. In there, in his book, is this map of the Overland Mail routes. It came from both St. Louis and Memphis. Out of St. Louis, it went on the, as you'll see here in a moment, it went on what was called PRR. I'll show you here. PRR. On the left, this is the full timetable. The very first one was printed, and timetables for stagecoach lines are very, very rare. I've only found 2 in all the research I've done. One of them was in Mississippi, coming out of Shreve Pits, going east to run into the Vicksburg, and later came to Illinois. And then the other one was up in Arkansas, in western Arkansas, northwest Arkansas.
Yeah, maybe you can pick up the other mic there. This is the first portion of the trip.
This is showing every Wednesday and Thursday, the stagecoaches would leave both St. Louis and Memphis. This is the St. Louis side, showing the time. So the first one there is 160 miles. It says the PRR terminus. That was at Tipton, Missouri. That was as far west PRR, by the way, it's Pacific Railroad of Missouri. It was a 5'6" gauge, going to Kansas City. It only took 16 years to build Kansas City, right after the Civil War. Then you would go on to the stage. The first 116 miles per hour was the average. Then going down to Springfield, 143 miles. It only took just under 38 hours, and you were at looks as though it was about 3.5 miles per hour. At any rate, down to El Paso from. Either terminus, in this case from St. Louis to El Paso, was a total of 1,369 miles. You did it in 292 hours, days, and 5 hours, and you were on that stagecoach the whole time. That was an average of just under 5 miles per hour. Was the speed on that thing. So what did it cost? The original ticket. First westbound was $200 later, and the eastbound ticket to $100. Later they changed to $150 in either direction. Shorter distance, 10 cents a mile. It's about 10 cents a mile. $200 a great deal of money, of course, and for $200 you can buy a ride, or you can purchase enough food to feed a family for a year. For 10 cents, you can either mail letters or buy 5 of the coin. I found this one interesting. This day's pay was only this day, and 3 hour per acre, and you see the prices of other local down there. Room and board at the hotel was less than $3 per month. How fast did it go? Well, his stage line, and this was John Butterfield's stage line. He was a experienced builder. He had stage coaches up in the New England area for many years, so he used the Concord stages. And he did about 5 miles per hour all the way, sometimes a little less. The Postal Service wanted to service within about 25 days. He was doing it in 21 and 23. It said that they could get 12 miles per hour on level ground, but that was very short distances most of the time. It would take, you get about, average about 5 miles per hour. The Butterfield stage, this was typical of most stage lines. The stations were about 15 miles apart, basically 2 hours or thereabouts, depending on water supply. One of the passengers wrote in the bulletin, don't know that, probably just a newspaper at the time, 1860, talked about the number of horses that they used. They put 2 or 3 more, or 4 more if they needed. They changed about every 14 miles. There are 2 types of stations. One is a swing station. This is such as Plumbers. This is in Plummerville, which is about 30 miles or so east of Russellville. And they would change the horses or mules and put fresh teams on. Secondly, were the home stations. Now, about at Potts Inn is about 10 miles east of where I live. It is a beautiful 2-story building. Then it was a station that would be a station. You could get food. You could even spend the night if you wanted to. This is all the people had there. They would also have a flag. You could flag the stagecoach down if you had mail for it as well. When they pulled into either one of these stations, the swing stations, the hostlers had 10 minutes to grease the axle, to jack the coach up, take the wheels off, grease, hook up a fresh team. If you're riding the thing, you get off, stretch your legs, get a drink of water from a communal bucket with a communal ladle, and you wonder why everybody was sick all the time. If you had maybe you had a few trees, you could stand behind or bushes, or if the ladies were lucky, there was a fence you could sit behind. At the home stations, they were there for about, had 10 minutes for the change the livery, and you could go for about 40 minutes to get something to eat. It probably was going to be roadkill this year, you had no idea what was going to be. Are they comfortable? By today's standards, they were not comfortable. I don't have a slide on this, but let me just give you a little idea. Those of you who have a four-door car and four-door pickup trucks, Cindy and I both have Toyota vans, front seat, back seat. That's about the size of a Concord stage. The front seat, the people face the rear. They were about 3 fannies wide. The rear seat, you face forward. So now you're facing one of the 6 people there. However, there was a low bench that went between those seats. And the people on that bench faced forward. They were facing people facing them, and they had to interlock their knees. So you could get 9 people inside that coach. And even if you put 9 people in, I can't get 9 people. We can't do it. But that's what they did. That's the kind of that they did. And they were on that thing all the way, day and night. And all the coach had was a little coach light. And I said, well, one of our church members is 93 years of age. Buster was a bronc rider, and he was a rodeo. He's not a rodeo clown. He was a rodeo clown at the local rodeo about 3 weeks ago. I didn't know it or see it, but he was telling me, oh, it's the horses song thing. And the only reason you had the light out there is because the driver could see it on the light in the distance. If that light was moving, then he knew he was going to meet somebody else on the road. Oftentimes, people would get off the stagecoach at one of these home stations and try to spend the night, get workouts on the fatigue and some food and so forth, and hope that the next coach coming by 3 or 4 days later would have room for them to continue their journey. In doing the research for Texas, I did most of my research has been about Texas, because I started out with Texas, Orwell, Texas history. In this newspaper in the upper left, that was from the Galveston Weekly News, February of 1853, and the Postal Service is advertising for contractors to take on these routes. And so mail route number 7864 was Houston to LaGrange by way of San Felipe, New Ulm, Industry, and Fayetteville. Kind of sounds like the Katy route out there, which is what it was. 100 miles out back twice a week. Leave Houston 7 on Wednesday and Saturday at 5 a.m. Same thing the other direction. On the upper right here is the LaGrange, Texas Monument, October 1853, and so this is the company that actually got the contract. And they talk about having the coaches and so forth. In the center, I put my own little box here in the center, so it tells you where they were leaving. They overnight at San Felipe. Total travel time is 38 hours for 100 miles, 2.6 miles per hour. If you find in any of these stagecoaches, and you figure out that their speed, overall speed was around 2 miles per hour, Mussolino's, they spent the night somewhere. If the speed was up around 4 miles per hour, they went straight through. Then down at the bottom, I've shown a map there, and you can kind of trace a map. But they had a place called Cook's Ferry, which was, best I can tell, was at San Felipe. You crossed over there. It says in the narrative up there that the drivers would change, the people, the mail, the freight, everything else would change and go to the other stagecoaches. Trying to again verify what was the speed, and so one that came across this one, the Vero Express 1860. Kind of an interesting mail line here between Anderson, Texas, and Waxahachie. Okay. Anderson, Waxahachie, 155 miles through in 40 hours, and it says that 155 miles, Waxahachie, $15. There's your 10 cents a mile again. Only 5 in the lower right over there, only 5 meals taken on the road, and otherwise it's like if you didn't get to meals, they would try to make it right for you. So let's go to the rail side. Enough of the stagecoaches. 1870, BB&C. This is it's the sort of timetable that was in the newspaper, and it shows to Columbus was 83.5 miles, and the fare was $4.75, nickel a mile, whatever else. The Houston Tap Brazoria over to Columbia, from the junction, or from Houston to Columbia, 50 miles, $2.50. There's a nickel a mile, so it's half the price. Continuing here in 1870, we have the GH&H from Gallatin to Houston, 50 miles, $2.50. And then again on the right side, there's another timetable for that railroad. And here I was able to figure out that 50 miles it took 2.75 hours, or about 18.2 miles an hour. There was a nickel a mile until 1882, and at that point the Senate had introduced this bill, and they're going to try to say that they're reducing the rates for passage for the rail from a nickel a mile to 3 cents per mile, 1882. And this showed up before the Daily Advance, and in June it said law reducing the rate will take place after August 5th. At the end of the legislative session, plus 90 days. At some point between then and 1918, when the United States Railroad Administration took over the railroads, the price of the fares had gone from 2 cents for 3 cents down to 2 cents each. Well, when the USRA came along, one of the first things that General Director McAdoo did was to order a 50% increase in the base rate, so went from 2 cents back to 3 cents. Discourage unnecessary travel. They had run, there's a tremendous story about the USRA, and we mentioned USRA, but rail fans say, oh, well, that's a locomotive. There's a whole lot more to it than that. Let's talk about freight. Freight rates are expressed in cents per hundredweight, CWT, because we would pay for 100 pounds. If it were smaller than that, it would go as express. It would not be, was not rated the same thing that regular freight rates. For wagon freight rates were usually 1 to 2 cents per mile, per CWT per mile. So if you had a ton, that's 20 hundredweights, would be 20 cents a mile. So if you're going to go 10 miles, it would be 42 bucks. Wagon velocity in those days was about per hour. Daily distance 20 to 30 miles. You had to stop quite often when you're a freighter, because you didn't have the luxury of changing livery. The horses or mules or oxen that you had they were the ones you could pull all the way through. So you had to stop quite frequently, let them get some water, get some rest, get some grass, and then go. But you go into, and only one daytime, they did not run at night for the most part, but they did run at night. Wagon freight capacity in the 19th century started off at 2,000 pounds. Toward the end of the wagon era, the large wagons would carry about 6,500 pounds in the payload. The wagon and the payload would weigh over 10,000 pounds. And I have pictures of wagons like this being, in fact, the next photograph. You'll see how many animals are on this. This is a mural that hangs in a Savoy Grill in downtown Kansas City. I don't know if they're still open. I had dinner there one time. We were staff meeting here in Kansas City, and after the meeting was over, we were told, all right, where are we going? So we said, let's go to Savoy Grill. We had 2 taxi cabs, took about a dozen of us to that Savoy Grill. I will tell you, that was a wonderful meal. But you see here, these are all oxen. He probably has, each of those wagons probably had 10 yoke of oxen, or 20 oxen under to go to all that. Hollywood has always shown wagon trains as being people. And yeah, there were a lot of people were going west, and they were on wagon trains. But for the bulk of wagon trains, They were freight wagons. This is the Santa Fe Trail. Santa Fe Trail started off at Independence, and then later on, about 10 miles further west at Newport on the south side of Kansas City. This was about 800 miles, Los Menos. They followed along the routes where they had water and they had apple grass. Found in one of the newspapers, I'll show you, it's 845 miles by the mountain route over Bensel and Ford. And then later on, they came up with the Cimarron Cutoff. From the Cimarron Cutoff, you had about 40 miles in there with no water. So you had to be very careful to go across it. 1857. Now, Santa Fe, during the Republic of Mexico until the Mexican-American War, 1842 to 48, or 1846 to 48, we built the Mexicans. We got the New Mexico territory, got Mexican territory, most of the Arizona area, California. Santa Fe, though, was still the point where people would go to Santa Fe, for the wholesalers to Santa Fe. They sold goods of all kinds, going further west and going into Mexico. So Santa Fe manufactured goods and foodstuffs and so forth coming from the east would come down the river system, out the Missouri River to Kansas City. That's as far west you go by water. And then it would the wholesale houses there would then unload it. The shipping season going across the Santa Fe Trail only lasted. It would start in, you leave probably in mid-March, with the hope by the time you got into western part of Kansas territory, you didn't have the snow. Sometimes you did. Sometimes those wagon trains were stuck. Anyway, it showed 1857. The Kansas City wholesale houses report. This is when Kansas City Weekly Journal in 1858, that they had unloaded 566 Missouri River steamboats. A total of 57 million pounds of freight was shipped on the Santa Fe Trail in 9,784 wagons, averaging 6,000 pounds apiece. All those wagons required oxen and mules, sometimes horses, but not very often. And then in return, the area around Santa Fe was perfect for raising sheep. And so they began selling wool, and the woolens with the raw wool would go east to the woolen mills in the eastern part of the country. So they had some both directions. Wagon rates were always considered to be FAK, freight all kinds. There was no discrimination as to what you were handling, as long as it wasn't something really expensive. And most of the wagoneers got to be too expensive to say, no, I don't want to take it. But they never handled bullion or handling money or anything like that. The Galaxy Commercial, this is December 1853, wagon rates from Houston. It's my favorite place. But I went down there, since we'd already talked about going out to the Grange, being 100 miles. The Grange rate there was shown to be $1.50, so they're charging 1.5 cents a mile. You read the others as well, but that was all shown there in 1853. 1856, another in the Houston Weekly Telegraph, 1856, and another list of the stations, and comparing the rates from the earlier. Many times many of these rates were a little bit cheaper than they had been 3 years earlier, and I figure that had to do with demand, but also the supply of transportation. The rail rates, I should have said commodities or classes, I kind of got that backwards, but anyway, rail rates, this is where we started talking about commodities and trying, what are we handling? We set the rates for stuff we were handling. This little article, this is the only time I found this thing in this Confederate. This is the only article copy I could find, and it had the tapers on the original, and so it's really garbled. Well, I can try to help here. Cotton, let's say going to out to all the way to Richmond, it's 32 miles. A bale of cotton, of course it's coming back from Richmond, was 95 cents. And then they did it to sugar, was that was called a hogshead, was a container. And with the hogshead, well, the hogshead is a cask or a barrel, and the recognized weight is size was 63 gallons. Then molasses down there per barrel, corn per sack, ditto per barrel, per bushel. And a bushel of corn, held corn is 56 pounds. The USDA 56 pounds. Then you get down to all changed down below. You get general merchandise was about anywhere from 10 cents all the way out to 18 to 20 cents. Then it shows ditto, general merchandise per foot. Well, that would probably be lumber and so forth like that. You need to be measured by foot, so they've got the prices there. Then you get on down to pasture fares, and pasture fares were a nickel a mile. H&TC rates here, this is a chart that was in the newspaper there, 1856, and right after the Civil War, 1866. So after the Civil War now. Milliken was 80 miles, and from Houston, the rate of freight, again, this would be FAK, freight all kinds, was, looks like about 40, either 40 or 46, it's hard to tell with this copy, but this is the best copy I could come up with. But that gives you an idea of the rates again. 1873, same railroad, now, of course, 1873, the railroad was all the way up to the Red River. They have branches out, and there's a classification of rates. All right, you're still talking about cotton per bale. I think, well, how in the world do you know what bales going to weigh? Because you can, if you're one guy is getting a cotton bale, he only has 150 pounds of cotton bale. Another guy has 200 pounds. Guess who gets a better rate? Because they have 200 pounds. All right, so that would get into classifications, and this is where the fun begins. First class dry goods, and you can read it, boots and all that kind of stuff. Second class, a lot of foodstuffs. Third class was all kinds of implements, agricultural implements, and carload rates for second class. If you had a carload of flour, for instance, it would be rated on third class. You get a little break on that. You got a fourth class, and you see special rates with all kinds of grains. So this kind of early adoption of the classification. This was I'm skipping ahead here several years. This is a run-up to rail regulation. And you can see this is some of the ills that were practiced by the railroads, the abuse by the railroads. There's different kinds of discrimination, rebates. The pass system was a big problem. Finally get down to the Congress and trying to figure out what to do. They finally get down and they look in the Constitution, and Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 3 says, Congress has the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations among the several states and with Indian tribes. Bingo. So now we're going to get the ICC. Your State Commerce Commission was formed, actually came into being on February 4, 1857. As far as I'm concerned, it lasted 97 years, 93 years until the Staggers Act of 1980. My opinion, just my opinion, I think I'll say the ICC is a huge mistake. Everybody says, oh, well, the railroads. Yeah, okay. So we less if the search board doesn't say no, and I hope they do. I think that one of the problems right now with the railroads is the fact that, they're not doing carload business. They don't want to switch anything. Switch engines available in any of the locomotive catalogs. They don't want to switch. It costs too much money to switch. When I was sales manager in Baton Rouge, I was sales manager there for 12 and a half years. And we had 8 jobs every 24 hours, switching industries. And we call them engine starts. And it was a 3-man crew, so we had 8 of them. It was expensive. But one of the things I tried to do when I was soliciting freight is if I could get the shipper to put that freight either on a flat car, anything that had steel wheels, I didn't worry about that freight wandering down the interstate highway. But the railroads, especially led by, I think, Southern Pacific was probably one of the worst initially, is they decide, well, let's just let the truckers, we'll beat the truckers at their game, or we'll handle it cheaper. One of the things that they will say, they are saying, I'm paraphrasing here, I'm venting my spleen, is that, oh, well, we're taking freight off the highways. We've got all this piggyback stuff taking freight off the highways. Okay. Anybody know how many piggyback ramps in the state of Arkansas? Anybody know? 2. Only 2. You know where they're located? West Memphis and Marion, Arkansas. Marion, Arkansas is 10 miles from West Memphis. Then you have the CSX, the Norfolk Southern, and the Canadian National have piggyback ramps in where? Memphis. So any freight that is going to or from Little Rock has to move on Interstate 40. And if you've ever driven Interstate 40 from Little Rock to Memphis, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's truck after truck after. There's no trucks coming on Interstate 30 and Interstate 40, and then they get together on the east side of Little Rock. And then the railroads of Union City, oh, we're taking freight off the highway. Boom. So, anyway, enough of that. One more thing here, Railroad Commission of Texas, we have an attorney here who understands the Railroad Commission of Texas. Jim Hogg's gubernatorial platform in 1899, this is 3 years after the ICC, and begin to see the ICC is working, but that's all interstate traffic. This is intrastate traffic. The ICC had no jurisdiction over intrastate traffic. So Jim Hogg was not a fan of the railroads. He wanted to see the regulation put in place, and so the regulation was established in 1891. One of the first things that they were able to do, the Texas Railroad Commission did, was to establish rates. Now the ICC initially did not have the power to establish rates. They were given the power to establish rates in 1907. But from the get-go, the Railroad Commission of Texas had the power to set the rates. And so these are 2 tariffs that came out both on the same day in the same newspaper, the Gallatin Daily News. They have the one on the grain, salt, flour, and one on the right is for cotton. And these rates were changed many times because the carriers will say, oh, the rates are too cheap. And so they had a lot of in a couple of years, the shippers and the together, and they're all with a consensus on rates. Then they would go to the Railroad Commission and say, well, look, we want to amend these tariffs, and we all agree on it. So, well, that's what we want to do that. Fine, that's what they did. The rail division for the Railroad Commission of Texas was the last thing they had was safety and all that sort of stuff transferred to the Texas Department of Transportation in 2005, and that was the end of that. And as of today and afterward, the Railroad Commission of Texas has nothing to do with the railroads. That concludes my presentation, and if we have time, Jason, we have time for a little Q&A. Anybody have any questions? Gosh, that would be, all right, thank you very much.
You ever find another microphone getting back there? It's got a little charge. That other one was running on empty to start. All right, we'll take a brief break here, get switched over for our next presenter. Visit the ground a little bit. Let me tell you what I've got back here. I've got a table that's got flyers and programs from previous symposium. If you're into collecting historical things, maybe someday that'll be worth nothing, just about half what it's worth now. But if you collect things like that out of the nostalgia, on that table that's got part of everything on those tables, you're welcome to, if you want some back from the early years. Yes. Yes. I will do that. Yes. Yeah, for next presentation, also, there's handouts there on that same table. So you can pick those up before or after the presentation, and you'll have the map that shows what all Jim's going to be talking about on there. All right.
Thank you, Steve.
So people have picked up some of the old flyers.
Thank you for making the call. Oh, you're welcome.
Unless I have to lug back over to the office. Well, we have a new presenter to the symposium this year. We're excited about. He posted out his presentation, and we have to look at some of the information we had online about it, and published and some research we've done about it, and we need to have that here. So I think you'll enjoy what he's bringing to us. It's from a little bit different to us. It's not in Texas, but this is a bit of Arkansas. I'd like to spread things out a little bit. This morning sessions are more general and more out of Texas or out of the Cotton Belt specific realm. This afternoon, kind of group thing, so we started out 20 years ago in 06 with a Cotton Belt focus, so this afternoon we'll end with a Cotton Belt focus. That's where the program set up this year. I'll switch it on yours. All right, I'll put his presentation up here so he can get started on that. Introduce Dr. Jim Gattis.
Again, I strongly suggest that you grab one of these handouts. If you don't, unless you have a PhD in Arkansas geography, you will be totally bamboozled. Here's what my presentation is about. Helena, Arkansas. Pluses and minuses. One of the more prominent cities in Arkansas back in the early days. One of the few viable, usable river ports in the southern part of the Mississippi on the west side of the river. Once you get south of Cape Girardeau, Missouri, the west side of the Mississippi becomes the low side. Not a lot of good places that are flood-proof to put a river port. On the minus side, Helena was just sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time. As you're going to see later, the immediately surrounding geography worked to Helena's detriment. And secondly, and I'll explain the statement, place that made it less likely that a mainline railroad. So the bottom line is railroads, but it never was a major mainline town. Presentation is about, so you get up and go get it. Get into the details of how all this came about. Stay around for the next 45 minutes or so, and you'll see it and hear a tale of just how things conspired to work against this once prominent town. Comparing Helena to Memphis, you can see where they are on the map. So again, these maps are really going to come in helpful. Handy. Both of them, Helena and Memphis, started around the same time. And as I said earlier, Helena is one of the few places, really the only place on the west side south of Cape Girardeau where you could have a port and not have to have a huge levee to protect yourself. You're going to see on a map later, Helena is at the south end of a geographical oddity called, some say Crowley, some say Crowley's Ridge, that is, stands out like a sore thumb. If you've been in East Arkansas, or southeast Missouri, you know what I'm about to say. That area is almost as flat as the top of a billiard table, with the exception of this one north-south running ridge line that sometimes looms many hundreds of feet above the otherwise surrounding flatland. Helena is at the very south tip of that where this ridge runs into the Mississippi River. So Helena had a little elevation boost from being at the edge of Crowley's Ridge. To the north and south of Helena, however, there were swamplands, and again, as you're going to see on later maps, about the only way you could get a railroad in and out of Helena was through a rather narrow corridor, east and west. Railroad fever really got going in the 1830s. Arkansas became a state in 36. Not long after that, the legislature was in the business of granting charters, among other things, to a lot of turnpikes, but also three of the earliest railroads that wanted to get a start in Arkansas. None of these railroads were completed, however. They were just paper exercises. There wasn't the capital, the population, the industry to financially get these things going. And I'm going to take a little look at these three to help illustrate the point about the west side of the river not being very good for ports. One of these early railroads, Columbia and Bayou in Charleville, you see Columbia at the lower side of the map there, was built probably just to try to get the inland cotton out to the Mississippi River. This is one of the things I noticed from studying early Arkansas railroad history. They didn't seem to fully, some of them didn't seem to fully grasp what railroads could do, what their potential was. Some of them seemed to be viewed as simply an exercise in how do we get inland products to the Mississippi River where there's reliable transportation and put the freight on the river boats. They didn't grasp the concept of shipping things all the way by rail. So they're in the far southeast corner of Arkansas, a county that Arkansas was still a territory. It was a big cotton producing area. In fact, a famous map that was used during the Civil War to show the prevalence of slavery in the Confederacy. This Chico County, the population was 80% black, which meant 80% slave, 20% white. It indicated how the plantation system was entrenched as part of the state. The first county seat you see long because the county seat to a place called Columbia. Eventually, they moved away from Columbia, and later the courthouse that had been colonial was claimed by the river. Napoleon at Little Rock, it took off about the time Arkansas became a state. The U.S. government even built a maritime hospital there. The town apparently was a pretty rough place. Mark Twain mentioned it in a couple of his writings, and he disparaged it greatly. During the Civil War, there was an oxbow in the river where almost two ends of the river met each other. And it was a problem point for the Union troops after they took control of the river, because the Confederates would set up cannon on one end of the oxbow and fire on Union ships. And by the time the Union ships had come around the other end of the oxbow, the Confederates had repositioned their cannon and fire on the Union the second time. So a Union commander decided he was going to put into that, and the short distance between the two ends of the oxbow loop, they just dug a channel to connect the two. Well, that channel sent the current toward Napoleon, which didn't help things, and an 1874 flood pretty much put an end to Napoleon. So two examples showing how on the west side of the Mississippi, there's not a lot of good places to put a town, yet Helena was a little better positioned to be a river port. Well, moving back to our story, trying to determine where we're going to build some railroads in Arkansas, there were a lot of preliminary movements, a lot of talk, but little action. There were so many different variables in play. The Democrats control the state, and the Democrats in the 1800s were just the opposite of what the Democratic Party is today. The Democrats at that time were the people who were the conservatives, the ones who perhaps weren't really interested in internal improvements. The Whigs were more likely to want to build canals, railroads, to try to move prosperity along, but they were in the minority. The planters controlled politics, and they were looking out for their own interests. If you want cotton to New Orleans, you might want to ship it to Helena. If you wanted to move the cotton to Memphis, then a railroad to Helena was not something you were interested in. There were pros and cons to building a railroad to Helena, building a railroad to Memphis, and those two different potential endpoints battled each other. In 1853, the U.S. Congress got into the business big time of supporting Western railroad development by granting land grants, such as Mobile in Ohio, Illinois Central. Big one in our part of the world, building a railroad from Cairo, Illinois down to Fulton on the Red River. So if I can get the pointer to work. A diagonal line coming through Little Rock down to Fulton and then onto the Texas state line to connect with Texas. This authorization to support railroad construction with land grants also had a provision to build a branch from Little Rock to Fort Smith and a branch from Little Rock to the Mississippi River. So now we've got some money in play in the form of land grants. The question is, are we going to go from Little Rock to Helena, or are we going to go from Little Rock to Memphis? Some of the ideas that were proposed at the time build an Arkansas Midland Railroad from Helena west to Little Rock. What I found to be a very strange option in the amendment in 1857, somehow connect Helena to Little Rock by building up to Jacksonport and then using the Cairo and Fulton to get to Little Rock. Talk about an indirect route. That just shows you the straws they were grasping for to try to get a railroad constructed. There was a proposal for a St. Louis, Helena, and New Orleans. Multiple states were working toward that. And even a Helena and Charleston to go east, northeast from Helena to connect. So all of these proposals, of course, talk is cheap. The Because at the start of the Civil War, this map reflects early Civil War roads. You see Helena had nothing, nada, zilch. Whereas Memphis had railroads coming at it from 3 directions, as well as the beginning of a line from Hopefield, which was across the river from Memphis, toward Little Rock, all the way to the St. Francis River near Madison. So that's where we stood at the beginning of the Civil War. Helena's still hanging in there. Just a few months before the Civil War started, this horse railroad, I don't know what they were thinking, but somebody thought we needed this, but I don't think it was built either. Well, a little construction was done in Arkansas during the Civil War, but nothing affected Helena. After the state picked itself up and dusted itself off after the Civil War, once again, more railroad proposals. Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas. Just making inference from reading about where the different developers or incorporators live. Perhaps it was going to be a line through Pine Bluff, which from Pine Bluff to the southwest would have approximated what eventually became the Cotton Belt Route. In addition to trying to still jumpstart a railroad from Helena, they actively tried to interrupt the completion of the Memphis and Little Rock. I don't know the details of this, but apparently west from Memphis, the railroad was built in some swampland, which didn't always stay above water. So even though part of the railroad from Memphis to Little Rock had been built, the Helena folks were thinking maybe it's not too late to put an railroad built to Helena instead. In 1870, they combined 2 charters into the Arkansas Central, again trying to get railroad built to Helena. This Arkansas Central proposal was the red railroad in the middle of the map. You see from Helena west and southwest of Pine, and then a branch to Little Rock, a connecting railroad going to the east, and then from Pine Bluff to the southwest, again, what eventually would be built as the Cotton Belt. So about proposed connection going down to Houston on one end. Actually happened, not just what was drawn on a map with a color. The state granted some aid, they capital from the eastern bankers, and they completed a little less than 50 miles of narrow gauge tracks between Helena and Clarendon. Well, if you're a Cotton Belt aficionado, you know Clarendon. I'll mention that in a minute a little more. Now, some of the records from that time say, but best I can determine that's not correct. The general office was in Helena. They kept talking about expanding westward, Little Rock, Pine Bluff, Camden. But what actually happened was they went into bankruptcy and eventually reemerged as Arkansas Midland. Got an Arkansas Central timetable from the era. You can see not exactly making great time, 48 miles and how many are 310 for 2 hours, so rather slow. A little more about the Arkansas Midland. And notice on this map, this is a belt map from the time, and they emphasized the Arkansas Midland because they were in a traffic sharing agreement. Here's the Arkansas Midland line there, connecting with the main Cotton Belt line. As the Cotton Belt was nearing completion across Arkansas, the Arkansas Midland and another railroad, Batesville and Brinkley, which went north from Brinkley, changed their gauge so they would be compatible with the Cotton Belt and they could interchange freight. Of course, just within a few years, they would all go to standard gauge. You can see at this time that the Arkansas Midland sort of acted like a branch line to the Cotton Belt, to the Texas of St. Louis at that time. And you can also notice some other proposed routes that the Cotton Belt people were talking about. A branch line into Louisiana, and then this one getting towards Shreveport by going through the Magnolia. Of course, that was Arkansas Midland eventually added on another little railroad, a branch line that came south from Brinkley to the Arkansas Midland. It stayed narrow gauge until around 1900. The Arkansas Midland seems to have given up on trying to extend westward. They were just going to be content with having Helena as their east terminus and branching to two directions on the west, one stopping at Belt and another one stopping at Brinkley on the Cotton Belt and what was by that time had become Little Rock and Memphis, but I wanted to just keep referring to it as Memphis or Little Rock to keep things simple. And then around the turn of the century, the Iron Mountain got control of it. It was incorporated into the Iron Mountain in 1909. Okay, that's from the west. They wanted to build a railroad and talked about coming down from St. Louis. One of the ideas proposed, and you're going to see this pop up multiple times, build a levee to protect the land and then put a railroad on top of the levee, drain the land behind the levee, and then you can sell the land for productive farmland to help finance the railroad. It was noted, and I mentioned it previously, but I'm quoting from a source at the time, Helena is really the only high, and I'm using high as a relative term, high spot between Cape Girardeau and the Gulf on the west side of Mississippi. There were other legislative acts to try to promote railroad construction by giving them floodlands and then put a levee around the floodlands, drain them, sell them, get money to construct a railroad, probably with the sale of bonds. Idea to build from Kansas City. There was a railroad called Kansas City and Southern, incorporated in Missouri in 1880. For a brief time, there was a branch out of Helena, we'll see in just a minute. But this branch in Missouri only made it down as far as Osceola, Missouri. It eventually would become the line between Kansas City and another idea was to build a Helena and Northwestern to go up to that town of Jacksonport, and you can again use your map to find what they were talking about. There was some legislative maneuvering to help get financial support by giving railroads land or selling it to them for a low price, land that had been forfeited to the state for non-payment of taxes. Even with this proposed support, railroad construction never came about. A couple of decades later, this Batesville and Brinkley Railroad that I mentioned earlier was reincorporated as the White and Black River Valley. And it did complete a line between Jacksonport and Newport and Brinkley. The talk of extending from Brinkley to Helena never happened, probably because the Arkansas Midland had already accomplished that. Here's one that actually did happen. Iron Mountain and Helena. Now, its origins go back to before the Civil War, but it's been a number of years just sputtering. You can read this list of where they stood in the 1870s, time and time again, just constructing a little road bed. Road bed construction was cheap. It took real money to, as they said, buy the iron to get the rails, and that seemed to be where these railroad projects ran into a dead end. But finally, toward the end of the 1870s, you might say they finally cable and a lawnmower finally started. But they completed what they called a temporary narrow gauge line. They used part of the Arkansas Central, Arkansas Midland to get into Helena, and extended north to a town called Mariana. They finally made it to Forest City. Now, Forest City was on Rock, which would become the Rock Island line. Just kind of by sheer accident, I stumbled upon a piece of correspondence that, let's say, corrected what was published in information at that time, that the completion was in 1880, not 1881. Now, for a brief few months, it seems like this Kansas City and Southern that I had mentioned owned the Iron Mountain in Helena. So it looks like, that could have been a railroad from Kansas City to Helena. Two ends completed and a lot in the middle yet to complete. But that didn't come about. The St. Louis Iron Mountain and Southern would take control of this Iron Mountain in Helena, and it become part of an Iron Mountain line. I've highlighted the Iron Mountain construction. Make sure I press the right arrow. Here was the original Cairo and Fulton line here, which soon became, of course, Iron Mountain. And then the branch was built down to here and connected with what had been constructed as Iron Mountain in Helena. Remember, these dashed lines mean proposed. That doesn't actually exist at the time. It's just somebody's fanciful idea. Here's what actually. At the time, you see this branch referred to, once the Iron Mountain took control, as the Helena branch or the Crowley Ridge branch. So at this point in time, here's what we've accomplished. You have the Arkansas, which has gone west from Helena to Clarendon's on the Cotton Belt. And then eventually the Helena and Indian Bay. Iron Mountain and Helena. So Helena's got one to the west, local control to get railroads successfully completed in Helena. There were some proposals for other railroads to the west, and they sputtered. And part of the problem could have been the route that the Memphis and Little Rock took. Notice that the Memphis and Little Rock didn't straight beeline from Memphis to Little Rock, but rather on the west end, east of Little Rock. Notice how they went almost due east until they hit the White River. So basically, this part of the Memphis and Little Rock preempted any west from Helena, because you've already got this market area served by railroads, so there wouldn't be, this town's not big enough for both of us. Whoops, excuse me. I pressed the wrong thing. I knew that was going to happen eventually. Now, what's my page there? This line here is already serving the area, so there's not enough coming across from here. And we'll see that play out more than just theory in just a minute. There was a proposal for an Arkansas railway that was going to be built from Helena west across the state and go to the west side of the state at near Fort Smith, and even build a branch down to Hot Springs, west of Little Rock toward Hot Springs. That would have to go up and over numerous Washita Mountain ridge lines. If they had paid attention during high school geography class, they would have known that was a very bad idea. Never built. Mississippi and Little Rock Railway, this actually was constructed for a short distance, about 30 miles of east-west route in an area to the north of Stuttgart. You see the freight trains didn't even run every day. It basically ran from nowhere to nowhere, highlighted on this map. It lasted for a little while and then was foreclosed on, again proving the point that there's not enough traffic in this area to support a second railroad trying to get into Little Rock from the Helena direction. What does Illinois have to do with Helena railroads? Well, let's go back to 1837 and a little more progressive atmosphere up in the Midwest. The state tried to jumpstart railroad construction, but their first attempt floundered. They got something maybe started, but didn't really go anywhere. But later on, they got some federal involvement to help support railroad construction. And with that, in 1851, the state chartered an Illinois Central Railroad. Well, the initial idea was to build from northwest Illinois down to the south tip at Cairo, where the Ohio and Mississippi rivers come together. And the line to Chicago was a branch. Of course, we all know the line to Chicago became the main thing because Chicago really took off as a city. So before the Civil War, we got this railroad from Chicago down to Cairo. After the Civil War, the Illinois Central leaders thought, if we had a southern connection, that would help our business. And I don't know, and somebody else may have studied this, whether the Illinois Central bought Southern Railroad bonds just to try to support construction, or whether they thought these railroads are going to go bust, and if we own the bonds, we'll get control of them. So I don't know what their real motives were, but regardless, it wasn't long until the Illinois Central got control of railroads that formed a southern connection all the way down to New Orleans. In 1877, Central took these bankrupt southern railroads that they had the bonds of and made them into the Chicago, St. Louis, and New Orleans Railroad, which was essentially the southern part of the Illinois Central system. In 1889, the IC completed their first bridge across the Ohio River, so you had a through rail route, but at the time, this rail route did not go through Memphis. It went through western Tennessee, through Jackson, Tennessee, so we don't have the Illinois Central that most of us do as children. Now, as they used to say when we were children, on TV Westerns, meanwhile, back at the ranch, Collis P. Huntington of the Southern Pacific fame was trying to get some eastern railroads under his wing, and he merged a couple of railroads to have a line from Louisville southwest to Memphis, and then also a railroad from Memphis down to New Orleans through Baton Rouge called the Louisville, New Orleans, and Texas. Now, even more, and all this is going to come together in just a minute, so hopefully you can juggle lots of things in the air at one time. There was the Mobile and Northwestern. Probably their biggest accomplishment was publishing an elaborate document explaining how they're going to create this grand railroad. And they kept telling the prospective investors, the iron is on the way. Well, I think what narrow gauge railroad complete. That Eagle West I believe Eagle West, N-E-S-T. That may tie those back then too. Texans, Louisville, New Orleans, and Texas acquired the Mobile and Northwestern, and now they had some capital backing it, and they completed a line up to Helena. They completed some tracks in Helena. They got a ferry inclines built on both ends, and pretty soon they had transfer boats taking the freight back and forth across the Mississippi into and out of Helena. Now, just as an aside, that wasn't the only ferry operation that the Louisville, New Orleans, and Texas had across the Mississippi. There was also an operation down here between Arkansas City on the Arkansas side and a little place that no longer exists called Huntington on the Mississippi side. If you read about Huntington, it was probably just as rough and disreputable as Napoleon, Arkansas was. Apparently a good place to go if you were looking for a card game, other illegal activities, and you can let your imagination roam, or perhaps a good place to get stabbed, according to local news from the time. Well, the Illinois Central managed to get control of these lines from Huntington, and within a few years, the Illinois Central controlled the whole kit and caboodle to create their vast system of railroads in the state of Mississippi. And by doing this, they now had a line that went south from Chicago, Memphis, which most of us knew, on down to New Orleans. Had a line also down on the east side of the Mississippi River, and of course they could branch into Helena. Sometime, and I don't know when, it seems like the ferry landing on the east side migrated from Greenville to Trotter's Point. This was a schematic showing how the Yazoo and Mississippi Valley operation worked. You see, try to press the right button here. One time the ferry was out of Glendale, but then they extended down to Trotter's Point, and they're running the transfer boats more parallel to the current here instead of more crossways. And they went up into Helena and then down into their station. Here's a photograph from the early 1900s of the Y&MV depot in Helena, a fine two-story brick building. That's the freight part at the far as you're looking at on the right end of the photograph. The passenger part closer to us on the left side of the photograph. Here's another photograph from that time. This track right here, I believe, is the one that went up to cross the levee and get to the transfer, the incline of the transfer boat operation. A couple of pictorial depictions of various incarnations of ferry operations. It's a rather small photograph, but you can get a sense of how the tracks drop down to the river at lower water to get to that transfer boat. This is a more recent photograph of transfer boat operation. You can see a gap in the levee wall to get down to the boat on the river. And a closer up view of from the mid-1900s transfer boat operation. Well, how about from Helena to the south? South of Helena, you've got three rivers converging, and I'd already mentioned this town of Napoleon, Arkansas, which found it wasn't wise to be where these rivers came together. Even today, there's no highway that goes across this area. It goes south from the Helena area, and then this comes to a dead end. It doesn't even attempt to get across these swamplands. But they didn't stop him from trying to build a railroad and completing one. Memphis, Helena, and Louisiana. It was a project of the Missouri Pacific Iron Mountain System. They incorporated two versions, one in Arkansas and one in Louisiana. The last part to be completed was the part southward from Helena. And a 1913 newspaper article is indicative of just the continuing, ongoing maintenance problems they had with this section of track that went across the swamplands. I've shown with the Memphis, Helena, Louisiana, between near Helena. It was called the timetables Latour, where the railroad in the early 1900s really made Helena just on a little branch line. But initially, the passenger schedules didn't make Helena a branch line town. This is, to me, kind of an oddity, but it was something you don't normally see. Notice, even after the railroad was completed across the swamplands, one timetable routed trains from the north down to Helena, and not further south on the Memphis, Helena, and Louisiana line. You had a separate timetable and schedule going from Helena south to McGee. So initially, you might say these two, the older pre-existing piece of railroad and the new piece of railroad were not integrated. They were operated as two separate operations. Well, to the northwest, back in the 1880s, the railroad was extended off the Frisco to Eureka Springs, which was a booming health resort town. Eventually, this became the St. Louis and North Arkansas. They got ideas to expand it, not just make a little branch from the Frisco to Eureka Springs, but go further afield. It would eventually go up to Joplin to the northwest. And after one of many reorganizations, make it to Helena in 1908, and service, through service, commenced in 1909. The Missouri and North Arkansas cooperated with the Illinois Central subsidiary, the Gattis in Mississippi Valley, the ferry freight. M&NA used the Y and MV terminals there in Helena. A photograph of a motor car for passenger service in Helena in 1912, which indicates that the line was so lightly populated that you didn't need passenger trains with high capacity. Jim Wakefield says that this is a M&NA train at Helena, and I have to take his word for it. I have no way to verify that. You see that tall brick building in the background, it's still standing, and that's the one that some of the other Helena photographs were taken from. I climb up to the top of that building and shoot down on the railroad lines. So at this point in time, what have we completed into Helena? Well, you got the Arkansas Midland going to the west, and it eventually became part of the Mississippi system. You've got the Iron Mountain and Helena going to the north. It also eventually would fall under the auspices of Mississippi. The Yazoo and Mississippi Valley, which never really made it to Helena, only after the Louisville, New Orleans, and Texas acquired it did it make it to Helena. But of course, that eventually became Illinois Central. And then you got the Memphis, Helena, and Louisiana going to the south, which is also part of the Mississippi system. The Missouri and North Arkansas to the northwest. And one I have yet to mention, the Helena Southwestern. So Helena never got a spot on the main line railroad. Does anybody notice on this map what was left off? Yes, thank you, Gerald. For some reason, the Arkansas State Railroad Commission maps year after year did not show the Illinois Central, Yazoo, and Mississippi Valley line going from Helena to east. I don't know the backstory, but year after year emissions just make me wonder what was going on. It seems like the leaving that off had to be intentional. Again, there's a story for going to research. A little more detail about Helena. This is a map from the 30s, but it illustrates the point. Notice the railroads coming into Helena, Missouri, North Arkansas, what had been the Iron Mountain in Helena, and by this time they had abandoned this line because it duplicated, but this is where the Arkansas Midland had been. They were all just meshed together right here, getting around the south end of Crowley's Ridge, trying to stay high enough to get out of the water, but low enough not to have to climb over the ridge. So at the first part of the presentation, I mentioned getting in and out of Helena by railroad. You had this narrow corridor. This illustrates that. Only could get in this one little narrow net to get in to serve Helena, kind of a fish hook arrangement. So getting town and on the east side, you see the Illinois Central, Yazoo, Mississippi Valley coming down here, and then the transfer boat operation coming into town that way. This was one of those colorized photograph postcards, again, probably taken from that 5-story brick building that I pointed out earlier. And you see in the early 1900s, this was a hopping place, lots of industrial freight activity at Helena. There were also other proposals. There were lines to the east that I'm not even going to mention. A few other lines you see listed here. I don't think that eastern Arkansas really took off anywhere. I don't know what their story was. I'm not aware of a Helena terminal being built. Helena parking in Northern was built, but it didn't serve Helena. It was a timber operation further north. One that was built, the one I said I hadn't mentioned a couple of slides back, was the Helena Southwestern. A northern lumber company had many mill operations in the Mid-South. One of them in a place called West Helena, which you can probably guess just west of Helena. It's up on the high side of Crowley's Ridge. And the lumber didn't turn out being built according to the earlier announcement. It had a few miles of track and many, many miles of trackage rights, some across the Missouri and North Arkansas into east central Arkansas, and then some down the Missouri Pacific to get down even into Louisiana. For a while, they didn't file reports with the Interstate Commerce Commission. Eventually they did, so from those records we can find out a little more about the Helena Southwestern. How this railroad fit into the bigger picture. This is West Helena, and this is where the mill was. Helena Southwestern, the Chicago mill, lumber mill plant. Helena Southwestern here, and you see this formerly had existed when they tied into the Arkansas Midland line. Then a short bit of track was theirs, everything else was trackage rights. A couple of photos of their operations. You see a logging operation out in the forest somewhere on the left, and then bringing the lumber into Helena, or the timber. Well, as the 20s moved into the 30s, you had things working against railroads. You started to have better roads and motor vehicles, and then a double whammy of the Great Depression. Helena was geographically located, so they were especially vulnerable to service cuts. Illinois Central was operating with a deficit, We're gonna look at how their passenger service declined. Look at the early 20s, where you had multiple itineraries per day to get from Helena on a transfer boat across the river to and from Memphis. You could at least have 3 itineraries, if not 4 itineraries, to get back and forth on any given day. You had to change trains at Lula, but it was, they timed some of the connections very closely, but it was doable so long as things went on time. Just a few years later, Illinois Central cut back to 2 trains. Later in 31, one of those trains disappeared. By 32, what was left didn't even make good time connections. By the end of 32, Illinois Central decided to get out of the Helena passenger train business. However, they had to extend it for a few days because they had sold so many tickets when people learned that the service was going to be discontinued, that they had to go for another 10 days in 1933. But the steamer Pelican continued to provide freight service. Into the 1960s, but in 1971, we had some fire damage, so Illinois Central petitioned us to get out of the business of serving Helena. Missouri Pacific declined. You see in the early 1920s, you had a couple of itineraries to get from Memphis to Helena, and then one train down the west side of the river went all the way to Natchez, service back and forth, Memphis to Natchez, and then serving Helena in between. In 31, you still had one train that went all the way. But notice they had instituted MC, which means motor coach service, starting to see shorter distance trains replaced by buses. By 32, they, for some reason, inserted a long layover in the southbound schedule in Helena. And instead of MC, they're just calling it bus in this timetable. Missouri Pacific made one last hurrah. They instituted one of their Eagle streamliners on the west side of the river just before World War II began for the United States, going from Memphis all the way down to Tallulah, which is across the river from Vicksburg, if I remember correctly. And they had a rather unique setup here. The locomotive only had power equipment in the front half of the unit. The rear half was used as a baggage car. Second car, post office and coach seats segregated because of Jim Crow laws, and then a third combination buffet and coach setup. Excuse me. After time passed, they cut this back to Memphis to McGee. At some times they used a motor car on this run. The records from the time, this was covered a few months ago in an issue of Missouri Pacific Eagle magazine. This motor car was rather unreliable, so sometimes I had to use, standard diesel locomotive and a coach. But passenger service came to an end in February 1960. Cutting back, well, something didn't transfer in the file, so we got somehow a computer glitch. But first they cut back this part of the Arkansas Midland. They cut it back to here. And then finally just cut it back to right here. In also, there's been an elimination, and I talked about this earlier, of this duplicate track. The Arkansas Midland and the Iron Mountain and Helena were just a few miles apart and parallel to each other. At the beginning of the Depression, Missouri Pacific decided they didn't need both, so they got rid of one. Notice at some point in time, this place that had been called Latour became known as Helena Junction, where the line in the Helena diverged from the line that went south to McGee, the Mississippi, Helena, and Louisiana. Missouri and North Arkansas, in one of their many reorganizations, became Missouri and Arkansas. They tried to upgrade passenger service, bought some motor cars. But in spite of valiant efforts, that line went bankrupt. Parts of it were salvaged in the sense of take a little segment and form another railroad to run on it. They tried to get Kansas City Southern or Rock Island interested in the Missouri and Arkansas. That didn't happen. A few of these segments were saved, as I said. One of them became the Helena and Northwestern and had a rather short life. Started in 1949 to restore the track. The town of Cotton Plant had a barbecue scheduled to celebrate the return of the railroad, but the railroad wasn't ready to return at the date of the barbecue, so they went ahead and had the barbecue even though the train wasn't running yet. They finally got it running in the late summer and fall, but that didn't last long because it got attacked by its creditors, and you just had a little bit between Cotton Plant and Fargo, and that too went up for abandonment in '76. So here's a bit of remaining track of the former Yazoo and Mississippi Valley that you see today in Helena. The levee is on the far right side there. At one time there was a track that went up over the levee here. Abandoned Arkansas Midland track in Helena on the left. Probably the few, if not the only remaining Helena Southwestern rails in existence, where there's a street crossing in West Helena. This line that was built south from Helena across the swamplands was targeted for an upgrade in the early 1980s for chemical traffic, but about the same time, Union Pacific took control of Missouri Pacific, and UP had different ideas. They rerouted traffic off this line. Of course, they would end up, eventually, UP had control of both the lines through Little Rock and Pine Bluff, so they didn't need a third line from the Gulf Coast up toward the Midwest. So UP wanted to get rid of this line. They spun off some of it to a short line holding company, which was known as Arkansas Midland, so they were reviving a name from 100 years prior. Today, the only railroad route that remains serving Helena was the former Arkansas Midland line down from Forest City and Marietta. At Lexa, the Arkansas Midland takes over to run the trains on into Helena. This Arkansas Midland was, you might say, barely chugging along in the mid-2010s. They had a power plant there, but it closed, so we lost that source of freight. They completed an extension to a new port, but the port didn't really take off, so the rails just kind of sit there and became overgrown. Genesee and Wyoming acquired the railroad from Pensley, and you see that there wasn't that much traffic on this part of the Arkansas Midland. A fellow named John Edwards was named to take control of economic development in the area, and he was starting to make things happen about the same time that Genesee and Wyoming got control of the Arkansas Midland. There was a derailment. Arkansas Midland owners, Genesee and Wyoming, looked at the track and said, hey, business is low, the track's in poor shape, we just ought to get rid of this thing. Just about the same time as they were finally getting economic development in Phillips County, which is Helena. So Edwards went to work with various entities, including the Walton Family Foundation, to restore the track, and service resumes in the end of the year. Now, Edwards is an interesting person to be doing this. Notice that when he was growing up, he worked on a tourist railroad in near Little Rock. He became a lawyer and helped the family that owned that tourist railroad with some of their business affairs. The head of the Economic Development Agency, and seems like he's really doing as good a job as anybody can to help revive the economy in an area that's been hit hard by economic downturns, trying to get new business, and part of that is keeping the railroad viable to serve the customers, so shipping will be economical. So today we have the Union Pacific running between Wynn and Lexa, and they trade cars at the Lexa yard. The Arkansas Midland business has improved. They're up to service of 4 days a week. They've got 4 shippers on the line. You see listed what some of the commodities are. Trying to get another one. And notice the business has grown to about 1,000 cars per year. So many times what it was before the volume, many times what it was before Edwards took over. Efforts to continue to improve the track so they don't have to worry about derailments. Today, what you see at Lexa, they have 1 locomotive assigned, and and I'm not sure what the caboose does, but it sits around Lexa regardless. South of Lexa, and I don't know where the yard is or what the limit is, so this is a head scratcher for me. If anybody has any insight, I'd like to know about it. Switching a local plant there. And they also have some mobile rail car movers to help the switching. The former Reserve Pacific Iron Mountain Depot is a museum. The Yazoo and Mississippi Valley passenger station was torn down by the parking lot, but you see the freight station in the foreground. And in the background, you see that 5 still there to loom over the railroad yards to the south. There's a caboose on display in what was once called West Helena. And the Memphis Helena tracks to the south being converted into a quick-use, walking hiking trail. And in conclusion, we might say that there was a movie back in the 50s, it's really before what I know about, called On the Waterfront. And a line that I've heard from that movie is Marlon Brando commiserating about he was trying to be a successful boxer, but things didn't work out. And he said in this movie, a kind of famous line, I could have been a contender. Well, Helena could have been a contender, but geography fired against it, and we all know how that turned out. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Any questions?
What happened in the 1927 flood?
Okay, 1927 flood, I heard that.
How did they fare?
Well, I don't know from studying Helena. I know that that part of the state, a lot of it was underwater. I'm happy to dig this up, spur of the moment as we speak. 27 wasn't the only bad flood they had. There were periodic bad floods off and on all the time. I recently did a series of history of how K-road railroads and I can't, sometime, and I'm thinking 19 teens, wet, and I think they upped their levee system, and so perhaps by the time of the 27 flood, they had enough levee to keep them high and dry. But that's just a guess. I can't prove that. But I do remember reading in the teens something didn't go right, and so they got a levee improvements at Helena. Anybody else?
You had a classic line on a slide, I don't think you spoke it, and I barely had time to read it, but it was talking about where a proposed line was going through a bunch of lowland that flooded a lot, and somebody said the catfish will soon be in possession of this line.
Okay, yeah. That was in the era after the Civil War, but before the Memphis and Little Rock was completed. The Helena folks were, yelling, and now, of course, back then, if you wanted to do something, you did it in the newspapers, publishing back and forth. The newspapers back then were about like social media is today. If you've done historical research, reading this stuff, what you see on social media now is no worse than what newspaper editors did 120, 30 years ago. In no way grounded by reality. The bologna was chopped frequently back then. And to try to disparage the Memphis and Little Rock, this thing's, this in the swamps, it can't be successful. It's not too late to build a railroad to Helena or Little Rock. Yes, sir.
Are there any remnants of the ferry incline left?
Well, I didn't go look mainly because I don't want to get alpha-gal or Lone Star tick diseases, but the white line disease, it wouldn't surprise me if there were, but I don't know the answer to that. They'd all be on the other side of the river. Glendale and Trotter's Point, to the extent that I could find, don't exist anymore. They were all on the wet side of the levee. The levee is further back east, so in high water, they're goners. Thank you.
So much for bringing the presentation. Second, the research that goes into the presentation is all inspiring. All right, a short break and we'll load it up here. And it's going to take us a couple months. All right. Starting back here in the time. Turning the news on.
It's on presidential tours of Texas. I was doing some exhibit research. I help out the Rosenberg Museum with exhibits that they do several times a year. And so I had a few what I would call presidential items in my own collection, and we put together just something for their exhibit where they focus on something to do with the presidential railroad history across the United States. And so this one was a little more tailored to Texas because I hadn't done a lot of exploring as to what that entail. A friend of mine, who is good with the parties, created this, the two flags here. The one on the left is actually an 1882 flag. Like a lot of our, the flag of our country and stuff, the presidential flag, what they would call it, evolved over time. And so this flag was only used by the United States Navy when the president was aboard the ship. But it was kind of the de facto standard. It was replaced later in 1902 by a version that you kind of see today in the president's seal with the stars in a circle, and of course you go near a case. Even that flag wasn't used on presidential visits, as you'll see in the photographs I have here. Most of the time, what you saw on a presidential visit was the president's portrait, either oval or square, surrounded by flowers or decorations or banners or streamers of some sort. That was typically, the decoration for when it was a presidential visit. So the actual presidential seal wasn't used widely really until probably about 1920, as far as that happened. So just a little tidbit there. So the actual first stop in Texas for president was actually by U.S. Grant. It didn't even make the headlines though, and it was briefly overnight. And his train stopped in Denison, Texas. He was on his way to Oklahoma to meet with the Indians. And so he stopped there overnight, and 8 the next morning his train went to Oklahoma. So there weren't any speeches for public visits, so you wouldn't consider this a tour, and that's why I included the tour. But I noticed in the headline here on the Galveston Daily News, his name doesn't even appear in the headline there. It basically talks about a Ku Klux Klan. And then it mentions the president having to visit Texas, so that's how much notice that he got. And so thank you to Dennis Hogan for digging that up, because that was a pretty obscure notice. That was actually the first presidential visit to Texas after Texas became a state in 1845. There were a lot of presidents here during the Mexican War, or they weren't presidents yet, but future president during the Mexican War. But this is actually the first visit by a sitting president of the United States into Texas at that point. So the first tour, and this is where we start, came up with this cross-country tour. This is actually a map from this brochure they put out. They called it Tour by the President of the Pacific Coast. And he basically was going to begin this tour on April the 14th, and he made the first 1891. Of course, he's going to start out. He's going to start out in D.C. He's going to come down. He's going to really skip the Carolinas, go through Tennessee, Virginia, Tennessee, into Georgia and Alabama, and cross over into Arkansas, and then come down. He's going to enter Texas, or Texarkana. Of course, he's going to come down pretty much to the international Great Northern into Houston, and then going to visit Galveston. Back in those days, Galveston was bigger population than Houston, so you pretty much had to visit Galveston. And then he's going to move over to visit San Antonio and end up in El Paso, and that's kind of the route for Texas. And again, he's been over in California and all the way up into the northwest center part of the country. He's going to do all May 18th, 1891. So here's from his itinerary. So he spent arriving in Longview on the morning of April 18th and departed El Paso in mid-morning of the 21st. I realize this isn't really clear, but in the far left-hand column are the populations of the points here. And Galveston is still bigger than Houston by about 2,000. It's from the 1890 census by about 2,000 people. By 1900, that was, and thereafter, that no longer be the case. Houston would always be larger in population than Galveston. So he comes into Palestine on the International Great Northern, comes into Houston, goes to visit Galveston. Then he's going to come back to Houston and then move west towards San Antonio. And end up in a few stops between San Antonio and pretty much El Paso. Really nothing there for as far as visits go. Most of that's just try to get to El Paso. He really wanted to try to meet with the president of Mexico, which all of them did at the time, and usually they got thwarted because the schedules didn't permit. At Houston, there was a 90-minute stop, and the president addressed the crowd at the Capitol Hotel. Now, the postcard here says the Rice Hotel, but before William Morris Rice bought it, this was the Capitol Hotel. It was the second Capitol Hotel. There was an earlier one that was demolished in the 1880s, which too much chagrin of the people of Texas, because that's where the capital of Texas was for a while. That's why it was called the Capitol Hotel. But this 5-story building was built. The guy that built it passed away. William Morris Rice bought it, and then after 1900, the Martha Rice Institute bought it, and they built a big monstrosity in 1911 that's still there today. That was Martha Rice Hotel. He left in and out of, I could not find a picture of the GH&H and INGN depot at the end of Congress Street in right and left from when he was in Houston. So the presidential trains typically were highly decorated. This is actually a photograph of one of the locomotives that pulled Harrison's train. There was no note as to where this was taken based on a little bit of the background. It looks like it was in one of the western states. But like I said, as I mentioned previously, on the very front, and you can't see it as well in this photograph, but right there is probably his photograph of Benjamin Harrison surrounded by flowers. You can see flowers and streamers all over the locomotive. And this was typical that the locomotives were highly decorated for a presidential visit. Southern Pacific conductor J.K. Ryan reported to the dispatcher that the train left Houston at 2:30 a.m. and was reportedly at Columbus, Texas by 4 a.m. Engineer Walter Jordan kept the locomotive, which was a Galveston, Harrisburg, and San Antonio 440 number 62 at good speed. The weather was fair until the train reached Columbus, where it had been raining heavily. After sunrise, they reported there were crowds at every station along the route, especially Luling, Seguin, and other points, but the train only stopped to take on water. So there were no official stops there. Again, this is the first presidential tour in Texas, so people are going to come out to local depots to see what's happening. So the consist of the train was this is reported by I think it's the San Antonio Light. They said that the consist of the train was the baggage car Astion, the dining car Coronado, the sleeper Museum, the compartment car Ideal, and the observation car Acuna. And this Harper's Weekly magazine from April 25th is a artist drawing, rendering of the inside of the observation car Acuna. That's Harrison sitting there speaking with someone. I noticed that they put our ruler here in the newspaper advertisement, something we probably wouldn't put today for the president. You know, we got a hard difference between the president today. That's all I'm going to say about that. That's probably. So these are all Pullman cars. They were plush, had electric lighting and fans, along with the latest improvements of the era. So they were traveling in style. The president received a 21-gun salute from Fort Sam Houston Battery when he arrived in San Antonio. There was going to be this big floral festival. San Antonio had decorated with crepe paper, red, white, blue, but all that rain made the colors all run together. And so sadly, they had to cancel the floral festival and everything, but he still gave a talk at the Alamo, which pretty much every president that visited Texas in that time period, you give a talk in front of the Alamo. They put a little stage there. That was what he did. At the train departed San Antonio at noon. At El Paso, Governor Carrillo of Chihuahua, representing President Porfirio Diaz of Mexico, stood next to Harrison and gave him his speech at the courthouse. And then his train proceeded westward out of Texas. So that's a real quick idea of what President Harrison's visit to Texas. Our next one was who had planned in 1901 for this big tour. You can see on the map, this was his planned tour. Again, he's coming from Washington, D.C. He's almost identical route, except he goes a little bit further west, and he comes to Texas on the Sunset route, pretty much from New Orleans, and then goes across. Again, he's going to go to Houston. He doesn't visit Galveston this time, because Galveston, like I said, is already kind of an extra stop in Houston. But he is going to visit the first city president to visit also in Texas. Then he'll go down to San Antonio, then on west El Paso, and again, he's also going to try to meet with Porfirio Diaz in Mexico. Then go to the West Coast and all the way up into Washington State and come back through Colorado and back. He's going to try his idea was to finish at the Pan American Exposition, which was going on in Buffalo, New York. And that was going to happen probably sometime in May. That was the plan. So it was a 10,500-mile tour, 23 states plus the territories of New Mexico and Arizona. The route through the southern western states was very similar to Harrison's route earlier. Alabama and Georgia weren't included, but Louisiana was. And so like I mentioned, he was going to end up at the Pan American Tour in Buffalo. So here is a newspaper rendering of the Operation Car Olympia. This was the car that McKinley used. It was a very popular car. I said several presidents used versions of this car from the Pullman company, but it was called one of the most handsome cars in Pullman service and frequently used by McKinley for his travel. It says the other cars were the combination car Atlantic, sleeping cars Cameron and Helena, the dining car St. James, coach cars Wagon and Helena, and the observation car Olympia. All the cars were electric light except for the Olympia, which still used gas lamps for lighting. And besides his wife, Ida McKinley, the entourage included as many as 43 cabinet members. They didn't all travel on the entire tour. Some would come and go for different parts of the tour. Typically, the Postmaster General, Secretary of Agriculture, those kind of people would come in and out and join the president for various parts of the tour. The train entered Texas on May the 3rd, 1901, and arrived at 8 a.m. in Houston after being saluted by the firing of a battery on Buffalo Bayou. Governor Joseph Sayers and Houston Mayor J.D. Wolford were among the dignitaries that greeted the president. Among the thousands that lined the parade route through downtown Houston were over 10,000 school children, and he addressed a group of only over 5,000 at the auditorium. The train departed Houston at 10:20 a.m., 35 minutes late. It proceeded over Houston to Texas Central Railway, pulled by a locomotive described by the Houston Daily Post as, quote, decorated to great splendor. So, like the locomotive we saw earlier. And he went to Prairie View. They actually set up by the side of the tracks of the podium for him to address the people at Prairie View A&M. And he addressed a crowd there, and then he went on up to Houston Central and made a few little stops, minute stops as he called it, places like Hempstead, Brenham, and Elgin. And he spoke to a few people at each location. Occasionally he would shake some hands, but he proceeded onward to Austin. Sorry, there's the slide. There's pictures of the depots at Hempstead and Elgin that would have been there at the time that McKinley visited. So just like Harrison before him, McKinley was a Republican president traveling through a strongly Democratic region, but McKinley was very warmly welcomed, just like his predecessor. Back in those days, we were more genteel, and we would treat everybody very nice. The press took a few little digs, but very, very few. What I saw in the papers was very, very respectful, and everybody was just happy to have the President of the United States come to visit the state. That was a very, very big deal. So at every station along the route, there were basically, this is posted in the May 4th edition of the Houston Daily Post. The train reached Austin at 4:30, where an established crowd of 20,000 was assembled, and because this was the first visit into Austin by a sitting U.S. president. This picture here, although it had no caption, was reportedly the depot at Congress and 3rd that was at one time shared by the Houston and Texas Central and the International Great Northern. The INGN built their own depot, I believe, in about 1897. And later the HTC would build it about a year after this tour. The HTC would have their own depot, nice depot. And so this is probably where Harrison deboarded the train and went to the Capitol and spoke from the portico of the Capitol to tens of thousands of people. He was presented a silver key to the city by Mayor R.E. White, and then addressed a gathered crowd from the east portico of the Capitol. He dined that evening with his Austin host, and then he went to the INGN train depot. And at 12:30 a.m., he left for San Antonio. And as a Houston, there was a big parade in San Antonio. This time there was good weather. On Michael Harrison's visit, there was no rain and everything, so everything was decorated. It looked very nice. He made a stop at Fort Sam Houston, which most of the presidents did at the time, and then he continued on to the grandstand at the Alamo, just like his predecessor, who gave a speech there. So then he, from San Antonio, he proceeded towards El Paso. So he went to the INGN depot, and his train was heading off to the Southern Pacific, and they left at 12 noon for departure for El Paso, Texas. The San Antonio Express reported that the Southern Pacific engine 928 is just out of the shop and will take the train out. So the photograph here is actually in Del Rio. This is of the 928 being relieved by another locomotive here, the 749, and I guess all the photographers kind of got, you can see somebody's shadow over here, and so the guy took a picture of the train and kind of restricting their legs. This is a picture of the handoff of McKinley's two locomotives, and then the 749 took him on to El Paso. All right, so the train arrived in El Paso at 8 a.m. It was a Sunday, so McKinley, back in those days, the presidents didn't do much on Sundays. His predecessor, Harrison, didn't have anything scheduled on Sunday, and same thing with McKinley. So he basically just had, some cabinet member meetings. They had lunch. They attended a Methodist church there in El Paso. President Diaz of Mexico, again, sent his regrets. So this is the second president that doesn't get to meet with the president of Mexico. Basically, Congress, the Mexican Congress was in session. He said, I can't leave while the Congress is in session, so he basically sent a representative. In this case, it was General Juan Hernandez, who was sent to convey the official greetings of the President of Mexico. Monday, May 6th, there were speeches by General Hernandez, Chihuahua Governor, and President McKinley, to a crowd of about 10,000. The train departed for the west at 1 p.m., and that pretty much ended his visit to Texas. So, this is the they saw what San Francisco. McKinley's wife Ida had a lot of health problems. One thing was called phlebitis, which is inflammation of your veins. She apparently got a cut on her finger, which was treated, became infected. She got blood poisoning, and she nearly died. She was in a coma. In San Francisco, they took her to a private house where a physician could actually attend to her, but she nearly died. So the president spent 2 unplanned weeks in San Francisco while Ida was getting well enough to travel. And she did, and by the end of May, they basically traveled back to Washington. You can see they took that straight red line back to Washington instead of going the way they originally intended to go. And that, McKinley did not go to the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo in May as he planned. He waited till September, which unfortunately is where he was assassinated. You know, by that time, who knows, in May there may have been panic or that was going to shoot him, but by September it certainly was. And he was shot and he died. And, they had a funeral train that was going to take him back to his home in Canton, Ohio. And as was typical probably in the day, roads would typically issue a train order to have all trains stop out of respect. This is an actual order from the Rock Island Pacific, this is in my collection, ordering on September the 19th, all trains to stop at 2 p.m. for 5 minutes out of respect for the party president. So, I'm sure there's orders from all the different railroads out there. This is just what I happen to have to snag. So after that, we have Theodore Roosevelt. Now, you need to understand, Roosevelt was already a celebrity before he became president, because he had been, you know, the Rough Riders led him up San Juan Hill, all that good stuff. So Roosevelt was very, very, very popular. So he was coming to Texas for a Rough Rider reunion to San Antonio, and so he decided to make a little tour out of this. It was not a much wider tour than Texas. All he was going to do was come down here, see a few people, you know, visit a few people, and then he was going to go hunting somewhere in Oklahoma, you know, Oklahoma-Texas border. Roosevelt was a big hunter, so he had arranged for him to go hunting. So that was his real plan. But when he came to Texas, I mean, the crowds were just phenomenal. They were roughly 8 to 10 times what McKinley had as far as people turning out. That's the kind of celebrity that Roosevelt was. People really turned out to see him. So he had this special train that left D.C., and he had this private car, the Rocket, a Pullman Sleeper Forest, and this Buff Nation car, Viceroy. So he basically the train entered Texas, arrived in Sherman, Texas, on April the 5th, 1905, at 4:12 p.m. And Roosevelt addressed a crowd around 18,000 in front of this view on the left is a view of the crowd. There's the courthouse in the background, and this is in Grayson County. And so the number of people, 18,000, it far exceeded the population of the city, you know, that they were in. The people came from all over the city. There's another shot of it. So this just shows, this is just the beginning of this, you know, this is how it's really kind of in the sticks, if you will. So they really, people were turning out big time. So he made a public speech at 7:30 a.m. to about 25,000 people at the banquet at the Oriental Hotel in Fort Worth. And then his train departed, in Dallas, and then he departed there via the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas at 5:30 a.m. on April 6th. So in case you didn't know what a celebrity he was, look at all these ads for special trips to go see the president. I had seen these on any other presidential visit I've seen, or all these, the railroads placing these kind of ads to go see the president. So that's how popular Roosevelt was. There's a lot more, and I just picked these 4 and then talked about here. But if you didn't have an idea of what a celebrity was, that tells you right there. Ran special trains, you know, there's things that are saying that this SAAP is having sleeper cars and coach cars, and they're making all sorts of things. So they were really hyping up the visit. Also, there was a souvenir spoon that several jewelers in several cities were making that you could get that had a bust of Roosevelt, this Rough Rider uniform, and so they were really playing up the Roosevelt visit big time. So the ads appeared in major newspapers, hotels and restaurants were at capacity in some locations, and all the cities were decked out with flags and streamers and patriotic bunting. And as I mentioned, they had souvenirs. So here's the Houston, Texas Central Basic saying they're going to run a special train to Austin, leaving at 6 a.m. for the accommodation of those who desire to go to see the president. On the account of the president's visit to San Antonio tomorrow, the Southern Pacific and the Katy and the SAP, SAAP, are all expected to carry big crowds. Katie's gonna run a tour sleeper in addition to the regular sleeper. And the city ticket agent in the SAP says they wrote as arranged for extra Pullmans because they're expecting a capacity crowd. So he stopped and entered 1,000 at Hillsborough. That's the picture there on the left. And then he actually stopped at Temple. Now Temple had made overtures. They kept trying to get Roosevelt to stop there. And his aide says, look, we got too many stops, we can't stop at Temple. We're gonna go right through. He might be able to wave at you from the train, but we can't stop. Well, Temple kept going and kept going. And actually, to their credit, the city council passed some kind of honorary law that all presidential trains had to stop, but they would accept fines. And so Roosevelt heard that. He was really impressed, and so he did actually stop for about 10 minutes. And Temple persevered, and he admired their perseverance. So he also made brief stops at Temple, Ranger, and Taylor. He addressed the Texas legislature, and there was a crowd of 20,000 or more on the lawn of the Capitol. At San Marcos, New Braunfels arrived in San Antonio about 8:30. Late, there was no public appearance that night. He spent the night aboard a rocket. Northern Railway Yard under a military. Here's a picture of Rosenberg. That's the reason he was actually going to San Antonio. Entire day of Roosevelt. I mean, this guy, you know, was kind of energized, but he really did have, unlike a lot of people, pretty much could just go and go and go. You know, he got really, liked being around people, like, so Roosevelt was very, very active. So San Antonio, and the priors were coming for about everything else was doing the usual visit. They see him in front of the Alamo doing his, every president did that. This is from a photo postcard. It was the largest gathering in the tour. Estimates ranged from 50,000 to possibly 100,000 people. That's incredible for 1905. That's pretty incredible. So this is the, there's a couple of things. One of is that Katie actually published their schedule. He let the INGN and was going north to Fort Worth, and he picked up the Katie at Taylor. And so the Katie published their schedule where all the trains are going to go, no stops, just where the presidential train will be, in case you want to be trackside and try to catch it, you know, it's 3 hours in the morning. So it said after a grueling day of events on April 7th, Roosevelt's train proceeded directly to Fort Worth, and 3 hours in the morning, April 8th, leaving the International Great Northern, switching over to Katy. He arrived at Fort Worth at 9:45 a.m., and it was the last big stop on his tour before he was going to go hunting. So the railroads were prepared for another big day, a big opportunity. They promoted all the special cars and what have you. And he said Roosevelt spent over 90 minutes at Fort Worth, where he rode in a parade, planted a elm tree at the Carnegie Library, gave a 15-minute speech in the square facing the Texas Pacific passenger station. That's what you're seeing here is the TV. People were literally all over the TV station. You couldn't do that today. People on the phones on the roof. This is part of a panoramic view that's available online, and it's a sea of people. I just focused on that. That was the TV building, but that entire Roosevelt's platform is there. But there's an entire street over here in buildings that is just there. It's probably, like I said, they mentioned 30,000 people. He was then taken by a carriage back to his train, which is now in the Fort Worth of Denver, and that would take him to Wichita Falls. He arrived there about 2:30. Spoke for about 30 minutes. He'd only allocated 5 minutes, but there were several thousand people there. And in Vernon, Texas, he transferred to the Frisco. He was bound for Frederick, Oklahoma to do his little hunting party. On April 13th, you know, about a week later, he came back to Vernon and then picked up the Fort Worth and Denver. Then he went to Colorado to do some more hunting. And that was in Texas, was in Tex Line on April the 14th. And then he returned to Washington, D.C. on May the 10th, 1905. So that is Roosevelt's. Next, his successor, William Howard Taft, also came to Texas. And it was a big tour. It said it was over 2 months and 13,000 miles in length, traveled through 33 states, with plus the District of Columbia. This was the second most extensive to date for a sitting U.S. president. Actually, Roosevelt's 1903 Western tour, which did not include Texas, was a little bit longer, 14,000 miles versus 13,000. But Taft really, as you can see, now what's different here is he's actually going to leave his home in Beverly, Massachusetts, not leaving Washington, D.C. And he's going the opposite direction, he's going counterclockwise, so he's going to the Midwest, over to the Northwest, down to California, he's gonna come to Texas via El Paso, and then work his way east. So he's going in the reverse direction. So he departed Beverly on September the 15th, 1909, and he came into the Texas at El Paso. So here's a colorized postcard, which was very popular about the time that he came to Texas. So this says, "The way we will welcome Taft when he comes to Texas." And they have all these oversized vegetables. They actually took, today we call that photoshopping. They did their version of photoshopping by taking a real picture of Taft in his car, putting all these vegetables, around it. But, so pretty neat. There's quite a few. You can find these online all over the place. But it was just a nice one of Roosevelt kind of his visit to Texas. Taft. So the highlight is he finally gets to meet Porfirio Diaz. After all these presidents trying, Taft is the one that does it. So on October the 16th, Diaz came across the border of the United States. He was the first Mexican president to do that. And met in person with Taft, and McKinley Roosevelt both tried and couldn't. And so Taft gets it done. So he departed El Paso via the GHNSA on the night of October 16th for San Antonio. It was made up of a New York Central baggage car, the sleeper Hazelmere, that had Secret Service agents, the private car Tesh, with SP Vice President Thornwell Fay and his companions, and the Southern Pacific car Texas, with Brigadier General Albert Meyer and staff, the sleeper Simoto, with the delegation of the International Club of San Antonio, and an additional day coach for the train crew and extra Secret Service men, and of course the President's car was the Mayflower, that's the Pullman car that he was using. So he made some remarks from the platform of his rail car doing brief stops at Sanderson and Del Rio, and he made what they call 1-minute stops at Langtree. And he appeared on the platform in places like Comstock, and he would just bow and wave in and come back to talk to people. There were also brief pauses to acknowledge people gathered at Spofford, Uvalde, and Stavinoha before the train entered San Antonio at 7 p.m. on October the 17th. It said many thousands of people were gathered in front of the Sunset Depot to camp. So, of course, you got Sanderson here on the left, Del Rio in San Antonio. So after he of course again spoke at the Alamo and did Fort Sam Houston, all the things that presidents do in San Antonio. The papers did not mention the crowds for Taft, I think because they didn't want to compare him to Roosevelt, because Roosevelt's crowds were just insane. So there were probably tens of thousands in San Antonio, but there weren't 100,000 or 50,000 like there were for Roosevelt. But I noticed the papers kind of would just say thousands. They wouldn't actually put a number there, even though they probably knew, mostly because they didn't want the big comparison. Because Roosevelt again was already a celebrity before he was president. Taft was considered an affable man with multiple found him quote boring. That's the term people use. He just didn't have the charisma that Roosevelt. No fault of his, right? But it said the president's train departed from San Antonio via the SNAP depot on Florey Street at 2:30 p.m. bound for Gregory, Texas. He was visiting the ranch of his half-brother, Charles P. Taft, and the train made brief stops for remarks in the crowds at Floresville, Falls City, and Kennedy. Now, he was scheduled to stop at Taft wasn't Roosevelt, so Taft needed a nap, and so he was worn out, so he took a nap and kind of slept through Beeville, and the crowd there just kind of had to watch train go by. And of course, when he heard about it later, first the press said, well, he wasn't scheduled to stop here, and then they finally said, okay, he'll catch you on the way back. And he made good. He actually did stop on the way back, even though it was like 10 o'clock at night. But the train arrived at Gregory at 8:10 in the evening. And here's the picture of the SNA people on South Florida Street Depot. And of course, there's one in Floresville and one in Falls City. We don't see Falls City too much. These other postcards are rather well common, but Falls City is a nice one to see. So here's a picture of Taft on his half-brother's ranch in Taft, Texas. This was taken by Martin and Danforth. The newspapers say the president slept in on the morning of the 19th and played some golf. Taft was a big golf player, apparently pretty good at it too. And his half-brother had built a golf course for him on the ranch there at Gregory, Texas. And so he said he played golf on the new course that his half-brother installed, despite the fact that heavy rains had muddied the course. He again slept in on October the 20th, but did go to see a roundup of sheep and cattle, and that's probably what we're seeing here is roundup of sheep and cattle. The branding of some mavericks and a roping contest. He golfed again on the 21st against the Texas champion, Robert H. Connerly. And the story is that they played 2 rounds of golf, and the Texas champion Connerly won the first round, but Taft won the second. So he was able to kind of hold his own against the Texas champion of golf. He also visited his namesake town of Taft, Texas, which actually was a staff on the SAAP. His brother owned all that property. It was like 15,000 acres or something huge like that. And so he bought that and named that for his now famous half-brother, who was president of the United States. So his train departed Gregory at 8 p.m. on October the 22nd for the next leg of his trip to Houston and then to North Texas. He traveled to San Antonio on the SAAP, and this time again he stopped at Beeville about 10 p.m. and briefly addressed the crowd. He arrived in Houston at 7:20 a.m. on October the 23rd, and he proceeded to the Rice Hotel where he gave a speech from the balcony. And then he greeted people en route to Grand Central Depot, where he departed on the Houston, Texas Central towards Dallas at 10:30 a.m. There were brief stops at Hempstead, College Station, and Benchley. Now, the stop at Benchley was unplanned because the private car Tesh had a hot box. So they had to stop and take care of that at Benchley. So I don't know if you're talking about it, they just mentioned that it was unplanned. And so, because of that, there was a scheduled stop at Corsicana, which they, because for the time they spent at Benchley, they had to cancel that. So Corsicana got robbed in Rayburn Benchley. They stopped at Ennis briefly, and then the train arrived in Dallas at the State Fairgrounds at 5:30 p.m. So of course there's the Hearn Depot on the left and the depot in Ennis on the top right. He spoke to a crowd of over 6,000 at the grandstand, and this is the Dallas State Fairgrounds, before heading over to the Oriental Hotel for a brief rest. He attended a banquet at 8 p.m. and then went over to the Cotton Belt Depot. So yes, finally got a president leaving Texas on the Cotton Belt. He departed on the St. Louis Southwestern Railway to Texarkana. He had already made 177 speeches and covered 8,994 miles when he reached Dallas. Washington, D.C. on November the 10th, 1909. So that's it for the presidential visits. I couldn't find a picture of the Mayflower. This is actually a picture of him addressing a crowd in Atlantic, Iowa. So I had to take this picture. It gives you an idea of kind of what the Mayflower looked as far as the private car is. So if you want a copy of the article that this presentation was based on that I wrote for the Gulf Coast chapter of the National Historical Society, if you want to take this as your phone, you can email me and I'll send you a PDF of that. If there's any questions?
I've got about 4 or 5 comments. First of all, that picture for Fort Worth, that's the TV freight depot.
Yes, it is.
The passenger depot had a big tower. It's kind of a mini version of St. Louis.
Yeah.
In doing my research for Houston, Texas Central, I came across a newspaper article from the McKinney Gazette Courier, where Bank for Telegraph President Roosevelt entourage said, please stop in McKinney on your way down to Texas. We're kind of seeing for buses. Well, they didn't stop. They planned Sherman, they planned Dallas, so sorry McKinney, you're like that. But they sold tickets either to Sherman or Dallas, for passengers. Of course, they do the same thing through. Didn't stop. Which presidential visit was there in 1991?
That's Harrison.
Okay, all right, so if Harrison had been a rail fan, he would have the distinction of having ridden the old line along the Rio Grande, the tunnels.
That's right.
Along the Sunset
Elizabeth
Line,
route, yeah.
because the high grades were fruit, the high grades did not be built yet.
That's right, 2 years later.
That would have been great rail fan points.
That's true.
If you're ever in San Antonio, be sure to go to the Meeker Hotel. The bar there is very historic, and there's a lot of Teddy Roosevelt Rough Rider memorabilia.
There's
Display
Meeker
cases
Hotel.
leading into the bar. Very, very worthwhile.
It is, that's what
And
You didn't ask me, he didn't fall for the trap.
I was listening.
I know, he didn't fall for the trap. I was waiting to ask him where Lozier, Texas is. It was on Harrison's.
Oh, yeah, that was it, kind of. Why did they have Lozier and Valentine, Texas on the schedule for Harrison?
I'm assuming that
No
was.
Del Rio.
I'm assuming that was water stops. Yeah, they did have stop in Del Rio to change.
Well, why didn't you? There were other water
Yeah,
stops.
but you didn't ask me where Lozier was. I was gonna tell you, it's between. Oh, see, I figured, he knows, yeah. Well, where is it?
It's West Texas.
So, I was gonna give the Dennis Hogan answer, if you ask me the question, I would say it's between Pumpville and Malverde, because
Okay,
that's.
I'm not gonna say that. I wanted to see if you knew.
Yes, yeah, that was an ideal place for train robberies.
I thought it was interesting that all of those were Republican presidents in a
Yes.
solidly Democratic state at that time.
Yes, and there were some remarks in the paper about, how come these Republican presidents come to Texas, but the Democrats can't, you know?
There weren't,
Yes.
Grover Cleveland would have been the only one.
Right, yeah, and he was controversial, you know, so, but yeah, there was parts of the paper about how long Republican presidents are coming. And it's like, well, because, you know, they're spending all the money, as the Democrats would say, these guys are spending all the money, you know, on presidential tourism.
Well, I think there was a story, I think it was Sherman Stop. Roosevelt saw a Confederate veteran in the crowd, and I think he went and embraced him.
Yes.
And that was a real hit in the crowd.
Yeah, that was a recurring theme with Dennis talked about is that there a lot of it was reunification, you know, from the late unpleasantness of the Civil War. Harrison talked about it, McKinley talked about it, Roosevelt talked about it. Taft didn't have to talk about it as much because the other three had, but there was a lot of talk about reunification and about, at these parades, Confederates would show up and Union veterans would show up and they would all march together, you know, and so there's a lot of that bringing the country back together. That was a recurring theme. That was one of the benefits of having presidential tours is that's how people come, you know, get the idea. Yes, sir. Yes, yes, yes. The point he's making is that the reason that Grant's small visit was, and probably that's why he didn't really visit Texas. Grant probably knew he was going to be very unpopular in the South because not only was he a president, he was a Civil War general, you know. And so, yeah, McKinley was too. McKinley had fought in the war, but I mean, you know, his was a much lower, I think he was a colonel or something like that. You know, so his was a much lower rank and he wasn't considered, you know. So yeah, Grant played colloquial, which is probably the right move because he probably would have been an assassination attempt if he had done it. He did, yeah. Anything else? I know we're between lunch, before lunch, so some people are paying. If not, thank you very much, appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Our lunch is ready. And there's food for everyone, whether you RSVP to me or not. So, no worries. Go out the door, turn right, and head down the hall, get the additions, and enjoy lunch. I'm gonna have if it works, I'm gonna have a kind of slideshow going, do photographs back from like the first 10, 11, 12 years maybe, just some photos. Do some entertainment, I think. All right, enjoy.